My wife, with our son in her arms, introduced me to her friends as the babysitter. She didn't even say my name or that I was her husband. Nothing. Just the babysitter. Of the child I saw being born, of the child who is my whole life. And the worst part? She said it looking me right in the eyes, as if she wanted to erase me from her story. That moment changed everything forever. It wasn't an isolated moment. It wasn't something that came out of nowhere. Now, looking back, I realize it was a series of small wounds she inflicted on me, one after another, until the biggest wound came and left me breathless. It all started weeks before, with little comments, cold attitudes, half-finished conversations. Laura, my wife, was no longer the same woman I had met. When we got married, she swore we were a team, that nothing would separate us. But recently, she acted as if she was embarrassed to be with me. I remember that the day before that moment, I had to leave a work meeting to pick up our son, Daniel, from daycare, because Laura couldn't, according to her. She was busy with something important. I didn't say anything. I did it gladly, because I love my son. But what I saw that day unsettled me. Laura was in a coffee shop, laughing with a guy I didn't know. When she saw me, she looked startled for a second, but quickly greeted me as if nothing had happened. "Oh, honey. This is a friend from work," she said without even mentioning his name. The man shook my hand, smiled, and I, like a fool, smiled back. I didn't want to imagine things. I wanted to believe her. But there was something strange in her eyes. The same look I saw again the next day, when everything exploded. The day of the humiliation started like any other. I had planned to spend the afternoon with Daniel, but Laura insisted that I go with her to an important meeting she had with some friends. According to her, she needed me to take care of the baby while she talked about personal matters with them. I agreed. I always agreed. We went to an upscale restaurant. She was dressed impeccably, as if she were about to walk a runway. I, in a simple shirt and jeans, carried Daniel in my arms. When we arrived, 3 women were already seated at the table, all with glasses of wine in hand. They stood to greet Laura with exaggerated hugs. I stayed standing, waiting for her to introduce me. And that's when it happened. "Girls, this is the babysitter," she said, smiling. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. "The what?" I asked, trying to force a nervous laugh. "Oh, honey, it's a joke," she said, but didn't even look at me. The women laughed. I did too, out of habit. But inside, I was falling apart. I sat in a corner, with Daniel playing on my lap, while they talked and drank. They didn't include me in the conversation. It was as if I didn't exist. At one point, one of them, a blonde, wearing overpowering perfume, said, "Well, for a babysitter, you look very young. How much do you charge per hour?" They all laughed again, including Laura. At that moment, I realized it wasn't an innocent joke. She was doing it to belittle me, to erase me. I decided not to make a scene there, but in my head, something shifted. I felt a mix of anger, sadness, and fear. Fear of discovering that what I suspected was true, that Laura no longer saw me as her husband, but as a burden. When we finished, we left the restaurant. She was walking a few steps ahead, talking on the phone and laughing. I was holding Daniel's hand. Suddenly, I heard a name that set off alarm bells. Andres. The same name as the guy from the coffee shop. Yes. I had an amazing time, too, she was saying in a soft voice she hadn't used with me in months. Tomorrow. Of course. Same time. When she realized I was looking at her, she changed her tone and hung up. "It was a coworker," she said with a fake smile. I didn't respond. That night, after putting Daniel to bed, I tried to talk to her. "Laura, what was that today? Why did you say I was the babysitter?" She looked at me as if I were overreacting. Oh, don't be so dramatic. It was a joke. A joke? Laura, those women didn't even know I was your husband. Because it's not important, she said, shrugging. Besides, lately you've become very sensitive. That phrase burned inside me. It's not important. Just like that. As if our relationship, as if our marriage, as if I meant nothing. That night I slept badly. I got up several times, thinking about what had happened. And then I realized it wasn't just that moment. For months, Laura had been pulling away. She went out more, answered messages in secret, left her phone face down on the table. And the worst part, her way of looking at me had changed. It wasn't affection anymore. It wasn't complicity. It was indifference. 2 days later, I discovered something that froze me. Laura had posted photos on Instagram from the meeting with her friends. I wasn't in them. Not a single one. And in one story, she wrote, "Amazing afternoon with my favorite people." Her favorite people? What about me? She didn't even mention I was there. But that wasn't the worst part. Among the likes and comments, I saw one that made my stomach turn. Andres, looking gorgeous. She replied with a heart. From that moment on, I knew something was very wrong, and that if I wanted to know the truth, I'd have to find it myself. And what I found later was much worse than I imagined. Sometimes it's not the truth that hurts. It's the way it arrives. The first time I heard his name, I never imagined it would destroy my life. Andres, a man I didn't know but who was already everywhere. In her laughter, in her messages, and even in the looks she refused to give me. After the dinner with her friends and the humiliation of the babysitter, I couldn't sleep. I would get up in the middle of the night, go to the kitchen, drink some water, and just stand there in silence, replaying every detail of what had happened. Her laughter when she said it, the way she avoided my eyes, the ease with which she repeated it as if it were something she said every day. I knew it wasn't a joke. I felt there was something much bigger and much dirtier behind it. 2 days later, while I was at work, my phone rang from an unknown number. I hesitated to answer, but something pushed me to pick up. Hello? Are you Laura's husband? A woman's voice, slightly nervous. Yes. Who's this? It doesn't matter who I am. Listen, not everything is what it seems. I froze. It was the same phrase one of her friends whispered to me that night at the restaurant. Is it you? The friend from the table? Yes, I can't talk much. Just be careful. She hasn't been the same since she started seeing him. Knot formed in my stomach. Who? I asked, although I already knew the answer. Andres. Before I could say anything else, she hung up. I sat at my desk, my breathing quickened. My voice trembled, and I felt my heart pounding out of my chest. It was no longer suspicion. Now there was a name, and a confirmation. That same night. I decided not to say anything. I didn't want her to know I was aware. Instead, I started watching. And when you start paying attention, the things that once seemed normal begin to scream the truth. I noticed that every time she went out, she dressed up more than usual. New perfume, clothes I had never seen before. I noticed that every time she got a message, she smiled in a way she hadn't smiled at me in months. I noticed that when she spoke to me, her tone was cold, but when she answered the phone, it became soft, almost sweet. The strangest thing, she started going out on Tuesday afternoons. She had never had plans on Tuesdays. I decided to test her. One Tuesday, I told her I had to work late. It wasn't true. As soon as she left, I took the car and followed her from a distance. I saw her parked near a cafe downtown. Minutes later, a tall man appeared wearing a black jacket and a well-groomed beard. There was no doubt. It was Andres. They hugged, not a casual hug, one of those hugs where you squeeze tightly and take your time letting go. They sat together very close, sharing something on her phone, laughing. I felt heat rising through my body. I wanted to get out of the car, walk in, and punch him. But I held back. That night, when she fell asleep, I went to the bathroom with her phone. I knew she had a pattern lock. I had seen it many times. I tried and unlocked it on the second attempt. I opened WhatsApp. I searched for Andres. There he was. Daily messages, photos, plans, inside jokes. And something that made me clench my teeth. When you see him, remind me about the babysitter. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't improvised. It was a private joke between them. She had used me as a source of mockery in their conversations. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there thinking about what to do. I had two options: confront her and hear her excuses, or wait for the perfect moment for her whole charade to collapse in front of everyone. I chose the second. I started gathering evidence, screenshots, photos, videos. I even installed a small camera in the car to record when she picked Andres up. But what I didn't expect was to discover that Andres wasn't the only one. A week later, while going through older messages, I found one from someone saved as E. No profile picture. The conversation was shorter, but just as suggestive. Phrases like, "The hotel thing was amazing," or "Let me know when he's not around." My stomach turned. She wasn't just cheating on me. She was doing it with more than one person. A few days later, the friend who had called me asked to meet in person. We met in a park far from curious eyes. "I know what I'm about to tell you will destroy you, but I'd rather you know," she said, glancing around before speaking. "Laura and Andres. It's not just an affair. They're planning something." "Planning what?" "She wants you to leave. She wants you to get tired. And when you do, she'll keep the house and custody." I felt the world collapse around me. That night, while she slept, I sat by the window with all the messages open on my phone. I looked at Daniel, sleeping peacefully, and swore I would never let her take him from me. I didn't know how, but I was going to turn it all around. And when I did, I wouldn't just find out who Laura really was. She herself would destroy everything she had built against me. From that night on, I stopped being the confused man who didn't understand what was happening. Something inside me changed completely, as if one door had closed and another, much darker and more calculating, had opened in my mind. If Laura was waging a silent war to destroy me, I wasn't going to just stand by and do nothing. The difference was that she thought I was still blind, and that was my greatest weapon. Because when an enemy underestimates you, you've already won half the battle. The words of the mysterious friend echoed in my head. She wants you to leave, to get tired. And when you do, she'll keep everything. This wasn't just infidelity. It was a calculated, cold plan, executed with the precision of someone who feels nothing for the person lying next to them. I forced myself to act normal, to smile at her at the table, to ask about her day, even to send affectionate messages. It was all theater, and every polite gesture was an investment to make her drop her guard. The opportunity came one afternoon when Laura was in the shower and left her phone charging in the kitchen. There was no lock pattern, or maybe she'd removed it by accident. I picked it up and saw a chat with Andres. The last message read, "Tomorrow everything will be clearer. If he reacts the way we expect, it will be easier for you in court." This wasn't flirting. It was a legal trap. They wanted to provoke me so I'd hand them the win in front of a judge. I closed the phone and, instead of feeling the usual rage, I was overcome by a strange calm. The calm of someone who knows. The other person thinks they have you trapped, when in reality they're digging their own grave. That same night, I got a message from the friend at the restaurant. "We need to meet. There's something you don't know." We met at a discreet cafe, far from where Laura usually went. She sat across from me, her expression serious. And said, "She's not just with Andres, she's also with someone named E." I nodded and replied, "I know." I could see in her eyes that she hadn't expected that. "Then you also know it's all planned, that in a month she wants you out of the house," she continued. I asked her why she was helping me, and she lowered her voice. "Because Andres is my brother, and I don't want him involved in this. What Laura is doing is worse than you think." Then she revealed something else. There was a meeting planned with her friends, Andres and probably E, at a luxury restaurant. Laura was planning to take Daniel to project the image of the perfect mother. That piece of information lit the spark for my final plan. I didn't sleep that night. I thought through every detail. It wasn't enough to show the evidence. It had to be done somewhere she couldn't deny it. Somewhere the same people who had laughed at me would see who she really was. I called an old friend who worked as a photographer and cameraman. I asked him to come on the day of the meeting with a hidden camera and a portable projector. He didn't ask questions. He just said, "When you call me, I'll be ready." The day before the meeting, Laura tried what might have been her last jab. While we were making dinner, she looked at me with a cold smile and said, "Sometimes, I wonder what my life would have been like if I'd chosen differently." I didn't respond, didn't give her the satisfaction, but inside I felt that phrase was gasoline waiting for a spark. The day came. I dressed simply, not standing out. She, on the other hand, looked like a model ready for a photo shoot. Elegant. Dress, perfect makeup, expensive perfume. She carried Daniel in her arms as if he were a luxury accessory. At the restaurant, everything seemed to follow her script. Laughter, knowing glances between her and Andres, messages on her phone that I imagined were to E. My hands were sweating, but my mind was cold. I waited until she raised her glass for a toast and said, "To new beginnings." That's when I sent the message to my friend. In less than 2 minutes, the lights dimmed, and on one of the walls began a projection of photos and videos. Laura and Andres hugging, walking into a hotel. Laura and E in a bar, kissing, screenshots of messages with plans and mockery toward me, including the one that read, "Remind me about the babysitter." The silence was absolute. The laughter died as if someone had cut the air. Laura froze. The glass halfway to her lips, Andres looked away, and E, who was at another table, abruptly got up and left. I stood up, took Daniel in my arms, and before walking out I said, "I'm not the babysitter, I'm the father of this child and the man you tried to destroy. But the difference is, I don't play to lose." I left behind a room full of stunned faces, and Laura with her mask shattered, knowing that night was only the beginning of her fall, and that what was coming would be far worse for her than any humiliation I had endured. I walked out of the restaurant with Daniel in my arms, feeling the weight of something much bigger than simple revenge. It wasn't just the satisfaction of having exposed her, it was the certainty that I had opened a crack so deep in her perfect facade that she would never be able to close it again. And yet, I knew I couldn't relax, because Laura was not the kind of person who surrendered. Her silence after being exposed wasn't defeat. It was the pause of a wounded predator calculating its next leap. The cold night air hit my face as I crossed the street, listening to Daniel breathe peacefully, unaware of the storm swirling around us. I strapped him into his car seat, stopped for a few seconds to look at him, and swore no one would take him away from me. I drove aimlessly for almost an hour, needing to think, to let the adrenaline fade, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw Laura's frozen image, the glass halfway raised, her jaw tight, her gaze lost. I knew that scene would haunt her, but I also knew she wouldn't stay still. I got home late, my phone already full of calls and messages from familiar and unfamiliar numbers. Some were friends asking what had happened, others were from her, relatives demanding explanations, and among them was one from Laura. "We need to talk," I didn't reply. I wouldn't let her control the conversation. That night, I barely slept. I reviewed my evidence again, my recordings, and even drafted a timeline of everything, not just for legal strategy, but because I knew the attacks were coming and I needed to have everything clear. The next morning, Laura showed up at the house, walking in without knocking, with a fake calm that barely hid the tremor in her hands. "I can't believe what you did," she said, trying to sound offended. "You can't?" I replied without looking up from my coffee. "I can't believe what you did." She tried to turn the conversation toward Daniel, hinting that I was using him in our fight, and that's when I understood she was willing to do anything. Every word was a trap to make me lose control, but I didn't. I told her there was nothing more to discuss without lawyers present, and she left, with the veiled threat that this wasn't over. In the following days, things got more tense. I received notifications that she had filed for temporary custody, accusing me of being unstable and pointing to public scenes as proof. The irony was brutal. She wanted to use the exposure I had given her as evidence against me. Fortunately, the friend who had helped me was still willing to testify, and now another person joined in. A former colleague of Laura's who had seen her bring Andres to meetings pretending he was her cousin and who was ready to speak. The legal process sped up, and so did Laura's dirty tactics. One day, I found the mailbox broken with doctored photos of me inside, made to look compromising. Another day, I got an anonymous email with threats. I knew they came from her circle, but had no direct proof. Andres stayed on the sidelines, at least in appearance, but his shadow was everywhere. Even E reappeared indirectly when I learned he was also suing Laura over a debt. It seemed everything she had built was collapsing around her. In the middle of the chaos, I stayed focused. Daniel. The judge set a key hearing date, and I decided it would be the moment to strike the final blow. I compiled all the evidence into a flawless dossier, not just the infidelities, but the messages proving her intention to manipulate the custody process. On the day of the hearing, Laura arrived in her best, perfect mother disguise, dressed modestly, with printed family, photos to project stability. I brought something better, the truth. When the judge gave me the floor, I laid everything out. The restaurant videos, the hotel recordings, the messages with Andres and E, and the conversation where they planned to provoke me for court. The courtroom fell silent. Laura's face crumbled as the pages turned and the audio played. Her lawyer tried to object multiple times, but the evidence was so clear that the objection sounded ridiculous. The judge granted me primary custody and limited her visits to supervised ones, not as punishment, but to protect Daniel from emotional manipulation. As we left the courtroom, Laura looked at me differently, not with hatred, but with the realization that she had lost control forever. Andres didn't even show up for her. E was nowhere to be found, and her circle of friends, the same ones who had laughed at me, weren't even answering her calls. I went home with Daniel, sat him on the couch, and while he watched cartoons, I felt for the first time in months that I could breathe. I knew my story with Laura wouldn't just vanish, that she would always be Daniel's mother and contact would never be zero, but I also knew she would never again have the power to humiliate me or manipulate me. That night, as I tucked him into bed and watched him sleep, I remembered the moment at the restaurant, my voice saying I wasn't the babysitter. And I smiled. Not out of revenge, but from the certainty that, against all odds, I had won the war. She started, without becoming the monster she needed me to be.